One of the most pernicious things about those who embrace extremism is that they're more than happy to join others in hating additional groups.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch in New York City.
Their ideology actually brings them together with other extremist ideologies.
The Southern Poverty Law Center's 2023 Hate and Extremism Report documents a concerning rise in hate groups and extremist activities across the United States. Worse, the report shows how these groups have adapted their tactics to operate more openly, often exploiting technology and social media platforms to spread their ideologies and recruit new members. On this week's show, we'll dig into the numbers and the implications with SPLC Executive Director Margaret Huang and Interim Director of Intelligence Project Rachel Carroll Rivas. As we keep growing our library of extraordinary interviews, I want to make sure you're subscribed to the State of Belief podcast. Please visit stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You'll hear this episode in full, as well as recent interviews with Jamar Tisby, Rabbi Sharon Brous, Rob Reiner, Dr. Anathea Butler, John Pavlovitz, Bishop William Barber, and many others. It would really help us to have you subscribe, rate, and tell the people you're close to about all that you're hearing. The State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you made a donation, thank you for helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how to do that is available at stateofbelief.com, and you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my guests. Margaret L. Huang is an effective human rights and racial justice advocate who has led the Southern Poverty Law Center since 2020. She serves as president and executive director at SPLC, having previously led Amnesty International USA as the executive director. Rachel Carroll Rivas is interim director of Intelligence Project at the center. She has been working to expose the anti-democratic far-right forces and organize communities to respond to hate activities for the last 20 years. A rural sociologist raised in Montana, she has held the position of Deputy Director of Research, Analysis, and Reporting since 2020. SPLC documents hate incidents nationwide in its comprehensive hate report. And I'm very grateful to have Margaret Huang and Rachel Carroll Rivas with us to look at the highlights and the lowlights of this important report. Margaret, Rachel, welcome to the State of Belief.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us on.
Thank you for the work you do. Let me just start there. I mean, I think that sometimes you work and, you kind of are in your own thing and you don't realize how many of us out in the world are so grateful for what you are doing and the generosity of the Southern Poverty Law Center and both of you to help share wisdom, because knowledge is power and we need power right now. And without knowing what you all are sharing, we're walking around in the dark and you're bringing things to light. So I just want to start with, recognizing how important your work is. And also on a personal level, I'll just say from the Interfaith Alliance's perspective, how generous you are with, your expertise. My team has been working alongside your team, and it's been so gratifying, and it's helped us so much with our own work. So let me start out from a place of gratitude for all you're doing. I know it feels lonely and it feels hard, but sometimes you just have to stop and say, okay, we're actually doing something good, which we really, really, really are. So thank you. One of the reasons I was really excited to talk to you was the hate report. Maybe first, Margaret, you can kind of set the stage for, this is a major kind of a centerpiece for Southern Poverty Law Center. Like, what is this report meant to do? And then Rachel, maybe you can get into some of the, as we said, highlights and lowlights. But Margaret, why don't you start with just telling us what this report is?
Thanks so much, Paul, for the question and for having us on this show. It matters a lot to us that we're reaching across different communities across the country. And I would especially make the comment that having people of faith who join us in this effort to protect our democracy has never been more important. And you'll hear more about that as Rachel gets into some of the highlights and lowlights. But a little bit about the report. The SPLC is the Southern Poverty Law Center's Year in Hate and Extremism report, has been issued every year since 1990. To our understanding, it is the longest longitudinal study of far-right extremism potentially in the world, certainly in this country. And it gives us the chance to look at the state of extremism in our country in a one-year period of time. And so the Intelligence Project, which produces the report, starts at 0 every year and builds out the list. You don't automatically stay on the list. You only are on the list because you have taken action during the previous year to actually foment or disseminate or spread hate. And so for that reason, the report is a really good picture of that year. The 2023 report that we put out, in all honesty, was a bit of a surprise for me. I don't think it was a surprise for Rachel and her team because they're paying attention to this all the time. But I had expected some significant increases in the number of active groups across the country, but it was far more than I had anticipated. We've actually, in 2023, documented the highest number of white nationalist groups ever in the 33-year history of the report. And again, that's why the snapshot is so valuable, because we're not just looking at the various activities of the last year, but we're looking at the number of ways in which these groups have expanded or contracted in contrast to all the years prior. We also saw a very substantial increase in the number of anti-LGBTQ organizations, which is very much connected to the addition of some new groups to the list for the first time. And these are anti-abortion groups that call for not only the prosecution, but for the penalty of death for people who seek or provide access to abortion. And that is an extreme that we had not seen so dominantly in the past. And so the addition of those groups to the list, in combination with the anti-LGBT activism of that last year, means that people are taking the decision from the Supreme Court, the Dobbs decision, and seeking to expand it far more threateningly to a much larger group of folks. You would have thought 50% of the population would have been enough, but now we've needed to add more people to seek to restrict bodily integrity or to take away rights to bodily autonomy across the country. And all of this is on a foundation of white nationalism and white supremacy that continues to drive the highest numbers of hate crimes ever reported in the country. From last year, the FBI reports have documented the highest numbers of reported hate crimes, which of course are but a fraction of the actual hate crimes that have taken place. And the majority of those are targeting African Americans and other people of color. So we are certainly at a moment of great threat, of great risk, but also at a real moment of reckoning, because this is happening in large part as we build up to elections now in 2024. And these groups have made very clear that their goal is to attack democracy itself, to try to stop people from believing in the institutions of government and in democracy. And they're hoping that that activism from last year and the year 2024 will really frighten and discourage a lot of people from joining in our elections process.
Well, it's very bracing, and I appreciate knowing that. And as you set it up, you expected it to be bad, but it's worse than that, and that's really it's sobering, but it's real. And and you know what? And we're kind of getting this information, but some people, many other people are living it, and that's and it's really important to recognize that this is a document that is actually talking about real lives, It's not like just numbers. It's actual lives that are that have been disrupted, denigrated, and sometimes destroyed by the numbers that are represented on the report. Rachel, can you talk a little bit more about some of the specifics that came up as like really important for all of us to know about this 2023 SPLC hate report?
Yeah, I think Margaret really nailed it to say that our assessment was that it was a year of planning and preparation. There was this real sense from across the different kind of factions that we look at that they were building up for something big. And that doesn't mean that there was a year without incident. There was absolutely incidents. We try to capture different ways of understanding what's going on. So one is this organizational infrastructure, like the group numbers, because that's where power is held, right? In institutions, because institutions have the ability to move people around and get them engaged and to share narratives and messages and to get them involved in some sort of process or to ask them to do something. But there are, of course, people who are sometimes individual actors that are part of a larger movement or kind of the influencers that we see today, people who manipulate media. So we wanted to have other ways of measuring as well. And one of those ways is that we measure flyering incidents. So like the leafleting that happens that people unfortunately are familiar with, where you have like anti-Semitic leaflets or things that are dropped on cars or light posts, those sort of things. So we documented 7,000 incidents. That's not 7,000 flyers, 7,000 incidents where this happened, sometimes hundreds of flyers in each incident around the country in 2023. We also documented, as an example of the attack on our LGBTQ communities, 200 incidents of direct attacks and protest or bomb threats on drag story hour events. So again, trying to kind of capture an example of how this is playing out in people's very real lives, very much in person, in intimidation tactics that are being pushed. So those sort of give us that picture. And then we look at kind of, well, what are the main targeted communities, the messages, the narratives? Because we want the report to not just be a reality check. It could be simply that, but we want it actually to be more than that. We want it to be a tool for advocates and communities who then can work to prevent radicalization, to counter white supremacy, to counter disinformation, to get in front of false conspiracies. And so if they use the report to say, okay, now I know something, and that means I can do something with it, can figure out where the wedge is, where to interrupt that, how to get one step ahead. I mean, that's our real goal here. I mean, I've been in this work for a long time. We used to say that the work was kind of centered around name and shame. And that's not a really great strategy, particularly as I think for me as a human rights believer, right? I think the better strategy is how do we use this research to actually do good things? A friend of mine, Scott Nakagawa, calls it block and build. And so I feel like a lot of times that's my role in this work is, okay, block, like make the space for my incredible colleagues and people in this movement, our partners, Paul, to be able to do this powerful work. So some of the narratives that we uplifted that we want people to know, we see really being pushed and also kind of adopted are things around the use of dominionism and this tool of white Christian supremacy, this idea that there really isn't a separation of church and state. And in fact, that there should be one more dominant Christian group in a narrow version of Christianity, quite frankly, too. It is not held by most Christians in the US. So that was one. The other was, again, conspiracy theories, false conspiracy theories. And still, unfortunately, we see a lot of that in relation to anti-Semitism, QAnon, and that still thrives in the US. And we do public polling that shows that that's still the case, and we're not the only one showing that. So those were two, I think, kind of big areas that I'll uplift that were pretty foundational to something we were seeing around the narratives.
Yeah, I think, it's something that we, the dominionism and it's, kind of more, I won't say benign, but, not every white Christian nationalist is a dominionism, but they all kind of believe it, like we should have power. And Dominion, Dominion is like, okay, there's 7 areas of power, and we should own all of them. But you don't even have to get that complicated for a lot of white Christian nationalists to kind of feel like we actually, our version of Christianity is actually the root Christianity. Your work on dominionism and the connected work on anti-Semitism and conspiracy, it goes directly into what we are seeing and trying to counteract on the ground. And correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of this is pre sort of October 7th Gaza influence on anti-Semitic. It's the other kind of like Soros, or I'm just trying. Can you talk a little bit more about what you really mean by the anti-Semitism out there? Because, I think for a while, and these included a lot of my friends, we kind of diminished the idea of anti-Semitism in this country. It's okay. It's like it's not really there. And now that is absolutely not the way people are feeling anymore. What are the contours of anti-Semitism? And then I want to get into dominionism as well.
I mean, first and foremost, I think we've known when, like Margaret said, been able to look back through history at how these anti-civil and human rights efforts, anti-democracy efforts, particularly what we call in like the anti-government movement, so like the militia movement, that anti-Semitism has been core, particularly this because anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory, right? And in the US, it functions in kind of a particular way. And that is been for a long time. So pre-October 7th for sure. And I think the way it functions is important, and because it does come up in all the ways that the tropes of anti-Semitism are uplifted through these conspiracy propagandists online, and unfortunately by leaders who were in positions of power in the media or in Congress. And we know these tropes, right, around power and control and greed, and around even things like Holocaust denial, that extreme. But in the US, I think the thing that's really important that I feel like for us at Southern Poverty Law Center, we can continue to share is that, anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism is central to the history of the United States. And when we had an incredible movement for civil rights in which Black folks worked incredibly hard with their lives, gave their lives to the cause of civil rights, some of that victory was because of a wonderful coalition, a civil rights coalition that included a multi-faith coalition, particularly in the South, that also included Jewish folks in the US. And that coalition was strong and important. And it was tactically important for the right in the US to try to split that coalition. And that continues to be the case today. They want to split that coalition because they know an inclusive democracy will thrive and everyone will win and the few don't get power. And so this conspiracy of anti-Semitism in the US is that if you think Black folks are lesser, that there's no way they could have had this victory on their own. And so there must have been, is the conspiracy, right? This is the false narrative. There must be someone who did it for them, who made it possible, who manipulated the system so that they could benefit. And this gets told that Jewish folks were the ones behind it. And so in that way, anti-Semitism can animate anti-Blackness, and it can attempt to split the coalition. And so that continues to be a core piece, right, of the conspiracies on the far right. And that includes the militia movement, who was heavily impacted by, the accountability for January 6th, but still repeats these tropes again and again because they've been sold this lie about how some folks were able to manipulate the system for the benefit of others, when indeed that wasn't the case. This was a victory for civil rights, but folks worked hard for.
Do you know the work of Eric Ward by any chance? He's at Race
We
Forward,
sure
and he's just
do.
he's really great. He's been on this show before a couple times, and
Yeah.
and he's in the Pacific Northwest, like not in Montana, but near Montana, and he's just he's very persuasive in this as well. And then we unfortunately have the kind of Great Replacement theory, which is also an anti-Semitic trope, and that has been used and has inspired just the mass murder of people at Tree of Life. And so these are not just fun little ideas that are out there. They're animating hatred, and that's I just appreciate that you're still that you're bringing this to light today, because it really is it's a terrifying idea, and it's hard to figure out the way to counteract it. But Margaret, I would love to hear your thoughts about these tropes and some of what Rachel was mentioning.
Yeah, one of the most pernicious things about those who embrace extremism is that they're more than happy to join others in hating additional groups. Their ideology actually brings them together with other extremist ideologies. So an anti-militia group, which really could have been about mistrust of government agencies, can become the source of anti-Semitism, anti-Blackness, misogyny, a whole host of other extremist ideologies, because that's what pulls them together, is the conspiracy theory, is the finding like minds. And that it does the opposite with the people that it seeks to harm. It drives wedges between the communities that, as Rachel has noted, have had strong collaborations, alignment, partnerships, movement building together, but now are being broken into different groups being targeted by hateful actions and by hateful speech. And so it makes it harder for us to bring different constituencies together. And it makes it easier for them to feel more strength and power in their numbers.
Wow.
That's a real challenge for us. But fortunately, the Intelligence Project has really invested quite a bit in thinking about how do we counter this? Because we have to counter this. We're not willing to concede that our democracy is no longer needed or valuable. So we have to find ways to build the collaboration, the sense of solidarity that we need to push back. And that is very much on the prevention and the resilience side. And one of the things that I'm so deeply proud of our team for doing is really helping to lead using evidence-based models for how do we support communities who want to push back against this ideology? How do we create tools? How do we bring those different groups together to see how they're all unified in the attacks that they're under, and how to push back collectively? And that work is relatively new. That has only started for us in the last few years. But we are already seeing some really significant impact of rejecting out of hand this attempt to divide and pushing instead for a unified vision of what a multiracial, inclusive democracy should be.
Oh, that is so wonderful. It's like, yes, we can have the problem, but also we're offering some solutions. And I think too often we err on the first and we forget to provide the second. Up next, more with the SPLC's Margaret Huang and Rachel Carroll Rivas coming right up. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And make sure you subscribe at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch. My guests are Margaret Huang, Executive Director of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and SPLC's Interim Director of Intelligence Project, Rachel Carroll Rivas. How do people find the report? First of all, what's the best website to download it? And then also these resources. What's the best way to access all the richness of SPLC is offering here?
Yeah. So luckily, right now on our homepage, it's right there. So that's very easy, splcenter.org. And that includes all kinds of stories, data, maps that folks can access about the groups, the flyering, the narratives. And it also includes, some coverage around our partnerships with Peril at American University and our deep work on prevention. And that specifically is splcenter.org/peril, PERIL. And we have two, I think, incredible guides right now that we're offering. One is a parents and caregivers guide for preventing youth radicalization, particularly online. And we know that there is a real problem in targeting young folks in that online spaces where they seek to offer answers for all of life's questions. And then also a guide for community groups, and that might be support networks for young people. So those two guides are available. And then the other piece I think that's really neat that we're really beginning to share is how we're testing some on the ground work with our care centers, which are really essentially a community resource in both prevention and in moments where something may happen that is a direct result of a hate incident in a community. And this is actually built off a lot of incredible research that was done on some of the German models of addressing these issues in Germany. And then again, our own research on, how do we actually apply this in a US setting? How do we do it with the landscape and the resources we have here? So we're just very excited about all of that. Next, we're actually working on some inoculation tools using media on how we can help people from conspiratorial thinking. It's incredible. And it's really just, for me, such a moment to take all of what we know about the tactics and strategies of the hard right and say, wow, knowing that, we can actually do real research to get in front of it and make a difference, which I think is going to be for the long term. It's not a fast moving process, but it's incredibly exciting on what it could mean.
I want to go back to some of the LGBT findings that you had, because, I've been, just a friend of mine who has a church in Martha's Vineyard, of all places, and they had a pride flag, and they saw, they had a camera, and a young man came, lit the flag on fire, and then genuflected. They don't know if that meant anything. It might have been because he was at a church and thought that was funny. But he saw that he was being filmed, totally unafraid, and did this. And then we have other churches that are connected with Interfaith Alliance that where they had a drag fundraiser for a local LGBT group, and they had the Proud Boys came and busted all of their windows. And so it's just a really interesting kind of moment where I'm personally kind of trying to figure out, are we still moving forward, or are we moving back? Or it just, your report feels like the hardening of the resistance. And kind of this sense that we're not going to take it anymore. These people shoving LGBT down our throat, and, it's kind of like, well, not me. You don't have to do anything, but I'm just curious if you can give some more contours of that. And then I do want to get into kind of how religion plays into all of this. But let's start with the big picture with the LGBT, kind of the lowlights, if you want. But what does it all mean?
Prior to the Boggs decision from the Supreme Court, the far right, particularly conservative religious groups, were really focused on stopping abortion and access to abortion in the country. And now the Supreme Court has given them that opportunity. And I think that many of these far-right conservative groups are very worried about continuing to win at the ballot box without that as a motivating factor. They've been looking for something to replace abortion as the issue that galvanizes and motivates their base to turn out. And that's been a very powerful political base for a lot of conservative candidates. This issue of LGBTQ rights, or even just dignity for the LGBT community, has become the new scapegoat for appealing to conservative base interest and getting turnout. We've been watching, particularly in the Deep South, where the SPLC calls home, enormous numbers of attacks on the trans community in particular, LGBTQ community writ large, but especially the trans community. The amazing thing is that the trans community is less than 1% of the population. So we're talking about a tiny fraction of the number of people who even know someone who is trans. And yet you would think it was the biggest threat to democracy and inclusion in the country because of the number of bills. There's something like 560 bills currently pending in state legislatures across the country to prevent trans people from accessing equal rights in the country. And so this is really an organizing tactic.
That's
on
so
the
true.
part of
I mean,
of the right wing.
Yeah. Honestly, we in Manhattan, in my school board district, we had some very motivated Moms for Liberty folks take over the school board. This is a school district that includes Greenwich Village and Stonewall. And they passed an kind of an anti-trans resolution. And we're like, when some of us responded and said no, the rhetoric was so cruel and terrible. So, you talk about the Deep South. You don't have to go to the Deep South. We have it in Manhattan, in New York City. It's and you're absolutely right. Like, they're not going after, like, frankly, nice white guys like me who are married and, like, whatever, heteronormative, whatever you want to describe it. Like, they're going after what they perceive as the most other, and trying to, like, that's the scapegoat. And I just feel like that's, it is terrifying. I mean, I just, one of the things I'd love for you guys to do, just at this point, it's probably it's very late in the interview. What does hate mean? How do you describe hate? You use that term, and we all throw that term around. I'm curious, what does SPLC mean by hate? And I think of it because I just see, like, some of the vitriol and the way that, and I'm just, I kind of feel like it's like I know it when I see it, but maybe we need to be a little bit more specific when we talk about hate. Rachel, do you want to go for that?
Oh, it's such a question. So I think a few things, there is no language that's perfect, right? That's just the case. And hate is sometimes an incredibly important label that we can offer because it really is shocking, right? Like, to think about the idea of othering someone to the point of hatred. But also at the same time, my friend always says, kids hate broccoli too. So I don't know. I mean, it's a little different. So we've chosen a definition, and part of the reason we continue to use it today is because we have this longitudinal study, right? Like, we have this marker, and so the comparison is incredibly helpful. And we talk about hate groups as those that are either an organization or collection of individuals together that make up a group that, based on their own statements of themselves or their leaders or their activities specifically, they have beliefs that attack or malign, like, an entire class of people, typically for their immutable characteristics, but not only. And some of these groups, they're very explicit in their bigotry. And that includes white nationalist groups, like, we mentioned the Proud Boys earlier. We had 166 white nationalist groups in 2023. That was a 50% growth from the year before. That is quite shocking. And how those groups organize, I think, is incredibly important. They have no central organization. They have no central figurehead. They operate as a loose and, like, very decentralized network that are vying for attention. And in a moment like today, you might even expect their numbers to go down, but why not? Why is it raising? And that's because they are right now, their main motivation is from an external source. And that, quite frankly, is mainstream hard right political movement in the US, engaged in politics, in electoral politics. They find some promise in that political movement, in some form of alignment, not everything, that they think are between those political goals and their own goals, particularly in their animus towards immigrants, LGBTQ persons, Black folks, and religious or racial minorities, other kinds. They are not interested in necessarily building another political apparatus because they see promise in the existing political apparatus. They are also not necessarily setting the targets. They are happy to jump on board. So, for example, Proud Boys was happy to jump on board to whatever was the issue of the day. They're not setting the narrative or the target. When, quite frankly, political leaders on the hard right set the target on LGBTQ people, they said, sure, we'll show up every one of those drag events. We'll burn that, rainbow flag in front of that church. It's not because they chose that in advance. They see the political opportunity, they see the mobilizing opportunity, and they're happy to take hold of it and use it to manipulate for their own power in those situations.
Yeah.
It
seems like there's what I hear you saying, and but I feel like the election of 2024, which feels high stakes to people, and the one of our candidates has said, like, if we lose this, we're goodbye to your country. That's I guess they're kind of both saying that now and meaning different things, but one of them really means like goodbye to your white Christian country because après moi le déluge, and I do feel like permission has been granted in some ways, and so that I'd love for you to talk a little bit, either one of you, about the connection between, and you touched on it, but a little bit more about like the connection between this 2003 report and the fact of the 2024 election, and how you're seeing, if you are seeing, I don't know if you're actually researching this now, but what are the connections between what you found then and what's happening now?
Well, we do actually do an electoral extremism project where we do track both activity and narratives during like election specific activity from the hard right. And some of our early indications are that some of the things are very much the same, right? The same targets, the same messages, but there are a few things that are have grown or are more poignant. And that particularly is anti-immigrant rhetoric. Also, because we've done this for so long, we can tell you that's the same thing every election year. It is very clearly, a changing sort of focus when it comes to immigration as it relates to elections. The other thing that we can say is that I always get this question, like, where in the US? Where has it happened? Where's all this activity happen in the US? And there is some nuance, but reality is you can mostly say swing states, because guess what? Where there is political conversation and social issue conversation, these folks are going to enter the space and they're going to try to manipulate folks and push their message in that opportunity. And so the maps really indicate that. Florida, right? Places where there's a lot of political activity, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, right? Like Arizona. I mean, this is what we see. And so when we know that, when communities understand, like, wait a second, maybe this isn't real. This isn't actually coming from a place of like a true concern. This is actually just an attempt to take the moment and manipulate me. They have that opportunity to step back, find out information on their own, talk to their community, explore their own values. And I think a lot of times, even in our prevention research, we're finding that it's that moment to stop and breathe and say, wait, what's actually going on here, right? And I think about all the attacks on our public schools over the last few years. And isn't that part of what we were hoping to teach is exactly that critical thinking, that understanding of history, the full and accurate picture of what's going on, because that allows that skill. Like, wait, what's actually going on here?
That is, it's huge. And it is, I wish someone could actually say, could we pause and actually reflect? And I think that's what you're trying to do. I'm not sure that there's many public officials who are doing that. I'm not sure who that falls on, but it would be good if the religious community would actually step up and say, hey, could we actually reflect on what we're seeing and do a little 360 analysis of what's happening in our community? That would be a great role to play. I did want to bring religion in this because I can't help myself. But Margaret, like in the work, in all of this work, countering hate, learning techniques of how to do that, awareness, a narrative. What do you see as an appropriate and positive role that religion can play? And hopefully our listeners are paying attention here, because like we really want, I think it's so important that we step into this unfortunate, scary place, but recognize that we have a role to play in this.
Well, I think you just encapsulated the first step brilliantly, Paul. So the first is to stop and ask the question, right? And that is something that faith communities and other neighborhood community efforts can do, to really ask themselves, are we witnessing what we're being told by news media or others? Do we really see a surge in crime? Do we really see people crossing the borders in record numbers? Do we really see, the kinds of chaos that are described by one of the candidates? But I think one of the most important things that we have to ask people to do, and this is hard in an election season, because elections, almost by definition, have to be about how terrible the other side is. But what's really important is to imagine and make real the kind of world we want to live in. This prediction of the horror that is going to emerge is very motivating for some, because they are worried about what they fear. But just think of the power of the motivation of living in a place that truly reflects your values, your faith values, your democratic values, your being a good neighbor values. And what does that require us to do right now? And if we take that approach, I've always thought that people end up, while everyone can react to fear quickly, ultimately, the reason that I hope many people do go to the polls is because they're voting for the kind of future that they want to see happen, and that they want their children and their grandchildren and their, community to see happen. And so we have to remind people about the motivational piece too, not just what's at risk, but what do we need people to help make happen? And that's why what Rachel said is so important. This is a tool. This is not the answer. The report is not the answer, but it is a tool for helping people see this is not the world that we want to be in.
When we think of the great moment in American religious history, there's many things you could point to, but I think one of the pinnacles was like, I have a dream. And it's a vision for the future. It's not like, this is all the things I hate. It's actually, this is the vision. This is the future that we can aspire to. How can we get there from here? And I think that that's really important. And it's that's like very like rooted in the idea of religion, and the project, it should be the project of religion, is how do we get better together?
I think the other thing for me is that there is a lot of language being thrown at each other, particularly from the hard right, that is dehumanizing, that is claiming that some people are demonic, that is claiming that people, quite frankly, are, even this new term, unhuman, really. And so for me, I think that one of the central roles of those who are kind of our values holders, are folks that lean into that moral compass and those moral messages and that value alignment of the world, and the things that I think, are those soul things, those heart things, those spaces of motivation. Those leaders, I think, have such an incredibly important role of not othering, of humanizing each other. And that is incredibly difficult. I look at really, really rough things every day. My team is looking at sort of what we might call the worst of the worst, but the reality is they're humans, right? And so why are they there, and what's happening that this is where they're pulled into? And by recognizing that humanity and not succumbing to the temptation to do the same, what does it look like to lean into accountability? Absolutely. People are accountable. They're accountable when they do things that are harmful, right? By each other, by law, by society, but also to like humanize each other. And I think this new book that one of these far right, influencers has called On Humans, it just made me, I just thought about it all weekend when I came across it. Like, there is a task in front of us to humanize.
This is so important. And let me just say, like, this is the work. This is the work. It's the work of religion. I'm so glad we're in partnership with Southern Poverty Law Center. I feel like you're making us smarter, and also, this. I feel very common cause with Interfaith Alliance and Southern Poverty Law Center, and I really hope that religion will step up to this moment and recognize the opportunity, in fact, to see one another. Even those who are trying to unhuman us, and try to figure out a way forward. I think it's super important, and I'm really excited for the future. I'm hopeful, and you all are providing me some of that hope. I like to end each of my interviews by inviting our guests to offer something that's giving you hope right now. So I'm wondering if each of you might spend a moment or two and tell us what gives you hope. Margaret, you want to go ahead?
Thanks, Paul. And it's a great place to end. We have a campaign underway that is seeking to help educate and inspire young people to participate in the elections. And one of the reasons we've decided to do this particular campaign is because we actually surveyed and met with more than 1,000 young people across the Deep South to ask them what they knew about voter suppression efforts in our states. And all of them had heard something. Many had heard about Georgia's law, where you can't hand out water to people who are standing in line for 12 hours to vote. Others had heard about other bills and legislation that had passed. But when we recounted all of the ways in which states in the Deep South are trying to prevent folks from voting, they were astonished. And we saw the number of people who were committed to participating in November's elections jump up more than 30 points. And so there's something there that is giving me hope. People do wonder, does my vote matter? Look at what's happening in the world. Can my one vote make a difference? And the answer is, if you see how hard they're trying to take it away from you, then the answer is yes, right? And when young people hear that, they're very motivated to participate. So I'm feeling a lot of hope right now that the more we can help people see why their vote matters and feel that importance, I think we're going to show in November what really matters for the future of our democracy.
Rachel?
That was very good, Margaret. Oh, I don't know. Can I even say anything? Looking back, something that's kept me going the last few years is actually that our democracy survived January 6th. Like, we could talk about the awfulness of the moment, but we survived it. Like, we made it. And it was everything that I had always heard the right planning. I mean, it was literally exactly what they had talked about in every chat room and meeting and newsletter that I read for 18 years. And they were unsuccessful. Democracy thrived. Like, it won the day. So that gives me hope, sort of looking back at something. And then I think maybe just to dote on the organization for a second, I think something that gives me hope right now is the Southern Poverty Law Center's commitment to investing and organizing on the ground in the South, in a place that desperately needs deep work in organizing. And what a game changer to have a 50+ organization who has long invested in legal strategy, had some policy strategy on the ground as well, had a research strategy of looking at the hard right, but then to take that and add like what I would consider real power building by organizing in communities and connect those things together. I mean, it's why I came and showed up.
Wow. I am so grateful to both of you and to the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I'm just excited for what lays ahead with our collaboration and all the wonderful work. So I started with a place of gratitude. I want to end with a place of gratitude. Margaret L. Huang serves as president and executive director of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Rachel Carroll Rivas is interim director of Intelligence Project at the center and spends a great deal of her time working on documenting hate and extremism. And we thank you for that very taxing work. Thank you both for what you do and for joining me today on The State of Belief.
Thank you all. This is fun.
Please be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, or at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. We need your help to keep making The State of Belief. Become a partner in this crucial work with a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And share what you're getting out of this show with the people in your networks. Let's get more people listening and keep these conversations going on Facebook and Instagram and Threads at State of Belief. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. We'll observe Independence Day and Juneteenth with Reverend Thomas L. Bowen, who heads up Faith Outreach as Senior Advisor for Public Engagement at the Biden White House. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.